Before we actually get into looking at archaeologies of gender and how we get at gender in the archaeological record, we need to not only do a little bit of review like we did last week, where I just had you brainstorm a little bit around what archaeology is and how we define the concept and some of the key terms around it. We now need to be a little bit critical of the production of not just archaeological knowledge, but anthropological knowledge more broadly. And so in order to do that critique, we need to revisit and consider and discuss some of the different ways that we know about the past. And so one of the ways we're going to do this is through a critique of archaeological method. And then throughout the term, we'll look a little bit about theory as well. And then we're going to revisit method. Anyways, we have a lot to talk about. So this is just meant to be, again, a bit of an introduction, easing us into the term with some critique right off the bat. And that also means that we need to be critical not just of archaeology, but as I already mentioned, anthropology, more broadly speaking. Okay. So one of the things I would like you folks to be prepared to talk about there we go. This coming meeting this week is about how archaeology is only one of the ways that we can get at the past. So there are other ways of knowing about the past. And so this is what our exercise on Thursday is going to start with, is we're going to brainstorm and generate some of the different ways that we can know the past, or think about the past, or learn about the past. And yeah, so that's our discussion for this week. So before we get into that discussion, though, we should review a little bit of our way of getting at knowing the past, at interpreting the past, at extracting from the material record our history and our experiences in the past, or our humans' experiences in the past, is to review a little bit around archaeological research design, right? So we have to remember that, again, one does not simply roll out of bed in the morning and decide they're going to go out and do some archaeology, that all archaeology is informed by our research design, right? That we need to be organized and efficient and valid. But importantly, our approach to the past is going to be driven by the questions that we define. So we're going to define a problem or define a question. And remember that we talked a little bit about the scaffolded assignment structure last week. That part of this assignment scaffold structure is to help you build some of these skills around undertaking archaeological research. So we're going to define a problem, work on a research plan, and then we're going to get some of the real world steps around this, because you're going to be doing, of course, paper-based research this term. That we have to remember that there's all of the logistics of fieldwork itself, relating to funding and permitting and ethics clearance and approvals, and before we even get to do the research. Then we do the research itself, and then we have all this data we've collected that we then need to analyze and interpret, and then we have results we need to then disseminate more broadly speaking. So research is a very active process that we engage in. But again, the idea is that we need to organize it, we need to define what we're doing, and we need to have a plan in place so that we can execute this efficiently and also in a way that ensures that we get the data that we need to address our problems or our questions that we have. But while this is an archaeology course, this is an anthropological archaeology course. So we have to remember that archaeological fieldwork, while it might look a little bit different from ethnographic fieldwork, is still going to be based on some of those fundamental principles. And indeed, getting at gender, if we look at the history of research on gender in archaeology, what you're doing through the readings this week, we'll see that indeed, many of our interpretations, so the kind of back end of archaeological research, has been grounded in anthropological thought, right, and anthropological work in ethnography. So I did want to refresh people's minds a little bit around what ethnographic fieldwork looks like as well, keeping in mind this idea of participant observation in particular, because I think that this is, again, one of the things that situates anthropological archaeology a little bit differently than archaeology is practiced or as taught and instructed in other disciplines, is that through this anthropological perspective, we're also bringing in ethnography into the mix. And sometimes you'll see, and we'll spend some time talking about this, how ethnography becomes a core basis by which we can come up with our interpretations and get at things like gender and other aspects of identity. So when we talk about ethnographic work, we're often talking about work with living populations. So we have to be then think about, well, what are the implications of doing ethnography and using ethnography in archaeological work and interpretations. And so that's what's going to lead us into next week's topic, where we look at reflexivity and how who we are as archaeologists shapes the kind of work we do, and ultimately our interpretation and our analyses in the process of undertaking archaeological fieldwork and lab work, etc. So just keep that in mind. Again, I have a bit of review in here relating to the shift in even anthropological ethnography from positivist or positivism, seeing the field as a living laboratory, attempting to produce objective knowledge, to the kind of post-Mead reflexive approach, where we realize the intersubjective nature of the production of anthropological knowledge. So we're going to talk a lot more about reflexivity next week, but I wanted to introduce it this week and also talk a little bit more about, again, some of the strengths of incorporating ethnography into archaeology, but some of the limitations around that as well. So again, more background, again, which is meant to be review on what reflexivity and the reflexive approach looks like in ethnography and anthropology more broadly. Something we'll be talking about, again, throughout this term, and especially when we look at the roles women have played in archaeology, both in terms of the history of our discipline and in terms of the experiences of female archaeologists and women archaeologists and queer folk in archaeology, is that our fieldwork impacts archaeologists as much as archaeologists shape the kind of fieldwork that we take, right? And that also that archaeology is occurring in many cases within a broader social context, right? So that we have the involvement of what we call local peoples or local communities, and in some cases we're even being hired for and working for communities. So we have to be aware that, that this production of anthropological knowledge and archaeological knowledge is situated, right? It's not occurring in a void. And the very fact that archaeologists are working in communities and doing this kind of work is also impacting those communities as well. And so that's something we're going to talk about. Is not just the effects of fieldwork in terms of how we've understood gender in the past and the production of archaeological knowledge, but also how the field, how we create the field, how doing field work, how we produce archaeological knowledge has all been shaped by who is doing archaeology, etc., and also the communities that we're doing work in. So I want to talk a little bit more about these in lecture, and part of this is because this will kind of capture, as we go throughout the term, some of the experiences of doing field work that we'll see in our writings. So for example, Battle Baptiste, you'll see in Black Feminist Archaeology, has a very strong narrative structure where she talks very explicitly about her experiences in the field and how they shaped her as an archaeologist. And so that's something that I want to continue to tease out. So I want you to be thinking about this, that again, fieldwork is what we call has a dialectic, or it's dialectical, right? That there is this process by which we are building an understanding. And this is not just done by the archaeologists, but is done by the broader, other people who are involved in the broader context of the archaeological fieldwork. We can think about rich points. Agar has this approach where it's this idea that sometimes it's these points of tension or conflict that can arise where the richest are the richest source of interpretation and interrogation, right? It's often the most puzzling pieces of material culture that we spend the most amount of time analyzing and attempting to interpret and understand. And it's because of simply their rarity or their oddity or the challenges. And so rather than being defeated by them, we should see these as, again, opportunities to expand our knowledge. It also, this approach to understanding fieldwork as a dialectic also then emphasizes this point that the production of knowledge, be it anthropological, archaeological, archaeology, is that there is a process that occurs between interpretation and translation, right? That we must interpret the data that we have, the archaeological record that we have, and then we need to translate that information, those insights, our estimations, our analyses, all of this, into several forms that can then be understood and consumed by various groups, right? So we have to think about that as well, about how do we represent the groups that we work with? How do we represent these populations, these individuals that whose material culture, whose maybe even physical remains we are directly analyzing, because there can be issues that occur. And we see this in archaeology a lot, the tension that can exist when archaeologists are presenting narratives of the past that are alternative to master narratives, for example. So when archaeologists are challenging and we're pushing back older and older the dates for example, the arrival or the appearance of people in the Americas, for example, that's a really strong pushback against colonial narratives about peopling of the Americas, about what the Americas are and how they were created and discovered and all this stuff, right? So we have to realize that there are going to be these tension points, which we can, again, either see as points of rupture, as problems, or we can see them as rich points where this is where we really get to, again, dive deeper into what we do and why we do it, and focus on, again, translating and disseminating this knowledge that we've produced in a way that becomes meaningful to the people who is consuming it. This also means that it's open-ended, right? That that research isn't done in a void, and especially with archaeology, and when we think about gender, that this is really critical, is that we're engaging still with living communities, and that includes the community of archaeology more broadly. And feedback we get and new data as it comes to light means that we are constantly reflecting back on the work that we're doing, the analyses that we're doing, and seeking to do better into the future, right? So potentially this means that we are saying, hey, initially these were the outcomes that we came up with, or this is the interpretation we have relating to this particular site. However, new evidence suggests that we were mistaken in our analyses or interpretation, or we got it wrong, and that's okay. This open-endedness, I think, again, serves as another opportunity for archaeologists to think about, again, what we're doing, why we're doing it, how we're doing it, and to continue to improve, to do better. So I want to talk about this a little bit more in lecture this week. And again, then the next few slides, what I'm talking about is about how ethnography has been more explicitly incorporated into archaeology. I know this isn't something I spent a lot of time talking about too, so I thought it was important to spend some groundwork in this week's topic looking at this, right? The idea that if we really want to get at people in the past, we can use people in the present as an analogy, right? That we can understand what is going on with descendant communities in order to understand what their ancestral communities might have looked like, right? But there are issues with this, right? We have to determine whether or not it is appropriate to use and apply these analogies or this information obtained through ethnography in our analysis of the archaeological record, right? And there's a number of these, again, structuring principles that determine whether or not it is appropriate to do so. And again, often we look at things like, again, the closeness of descendant and ancestral populations, whether or not they can actually be determined or not. We have to think about some of the other logical or structural relationships that might exist between populations. So if we think about diaspora studies, for example, looking at the movement of people and places often means engaging with not just, so for example, if we look at the enslavement of people from the African continent and then brought into the Americas and parts of Europe as well as enslaved peoples, we need to consider the various groups that are impacted by these processes, both and the different aspects, those representing both different aspects of that power dynamic that exists, right? Those that are enslaving people, those that are enslaved, etc. As you go through that process. So that's part of that critique that we need to be, or those considerations we need to think, is that when the ethnography is being applied, when there is analogy being applied, which various groups are being impacted, how they're being represented, whether it is appropriate indeed for these connections to be made. So again, a bit more information about then what ethnoarchaeology looks like. What happens when archaeologists then engage in ethnography, and we can talk a little bit about some of the work I've been doing in ethnoarchaeology with basket making, and some of the both strengths of this and limitations of these different kinds of approaches. And again, one of the things that ethnoarchaeology has been extremely critical in is understanding how larger institutions and structures like colonialism have shaped the experiences of people in the past. And that's because we can see the consequences, the long-term consequences of colonialism in communities today. So to discuss this some of these problems and limitations a little bit more, I did assign the work of Kehoe, so we'll look at that, and we have discussion questions coming up momentarily that we will look at as well. One of the things we do have to be considerate about when we're using ethnographic work that we ourselves as archaeologists have not undertaken is that, again, we have to be critical of the context in which those were produced, right? Is that there can be a very strong Euro-American and colonial bias, particularly in early anthropological work. So again, it doesn't mean that we need to just disregard them outright, but we have to realize and recognize what various aspects of bias are being represented in these kinds of works. And again, next week, we'll look at how bias is constructed and the various, again, structuring principles that shape our experiences as individuals and as communities. We'll look at this a little bit more. Of course, because this is a course looking at gender, one of the things that I'd like you to consider, and we'll talk about more in lecture this week or in our discussion this week, is about who the archaeologist or the ethnographer is, how that shapes the kinds of data that they have the capacity to collect, the groups that they're able to get in, the inroads they're able to make, how communication is shaped, how dissemination occurs, right? So the gender of the archaeologist and the anthropologist is actually very critical to consider, and is a key factor in shaping, again, the production at the end of the knowledge that's being utilized. One of the things I'd like to talk about is this quote I put here about that Weidman comments on about how women researchers, particularly cis female researchers, tend to accrue or reflect upon having obtained kind of the status in field work of that of an asexual honorary male or a pseudo-female because of a race, class, and Western identity. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. I've had experiences with that, and we'll talk about, again, some of the issues with that, but also some of the benefits that comes actually from what happens when we degender archaeologists in some sort of way. So we'll talk about this a little bit more. Participation of fieldwork is also another, or sorry, not participation, duration of fieldwork is another contentious issue we'll talk about a little bit. Okay, so what are our goals for this week? Again, other than kind of considering this relationship between archaeology and anthropology, between archaeological fieldwork and ethnographic fieldwork, considering how do we produce our narratives or our interpretations of the past, how do we learn about the past, is I'd like us to go over the readings assigned for this week. So Kehoe is a little bit separate from, sorry, the other ones. The other ones give us a bit more of a historical overview of approaches to gender in archaeology, whereas Kehoe talks about some of the major issues specific to Great Plains archaeology and how, quote unquote, women have appeared in the plains. So I want to talk about this a little bit more and also talk about some of the other key points that Kehoe brings up relating to the terms that we use and how they also matter, prehistory versus history, etc. Okay. And then again, one of the things we have to keep in mind is that archaeological thought has also changed over time. So this then has shaped our approach to the question of gender, what gender is, how do we get a gender in the archaeological record, is shaped by archaeology more broadly, right? So if we think about the trends we see and how gender came to be a topic in archaeology, this is where those kind of overview articles are really critical, but we have to think about not just, again, archaeology as a discipline, but how larger societal processes might have shaped what we do and do not do in archaeology. So for the other three readings, what I tried to do was focus on one of the key writers in archaeology of gender, which is May Conkey. And so we'll look at the work of Conkey, and we'll look at one of the most foundational readings in archaeologies of gender, which is Conkey and Spector's 1984 article. And then we're going to jump forward about 10 years, right, to Conkey and Giro's work in the late 90s. Giro is also another key figure, Janet Spector, in archaeologies of gender and feminist archaeologies. And then finally, Conkey's article from 2007. So we have 30 years of discourse on this, and then I want you to start to think about, okay, here we are, 2022. It's a hard year to say. I want you to think about, well, where are we today? What is the state or status of archaeology today? And that's actually what we're going to be looking at through the rest of the course. I don't expect to find an answer, but what are you thinking about? What are our approaches to gender? How might they have changed in light of what's going on in our world today, especially what's happened in the 40 years since Conkey and Spector and others really started to write about gender in archaeology. Okay, So again, a lot of reading this week. I provided some summaries, some high-level executive summaries of the articles as well to kind of set you up for our discussion this week. But like I said, our discussion this week is meant to be a little bit of review around methods, but also focusing then a little bit on history of thought in this key area. Again, by looking at the work of one key figure in this area. So. And then I've given you just a quick summary, a chronology of what the history of archaeology looks like if we focus on gender as a topic. And again, I want to talk about a lot more about this in lecture on Thursday, because keeping in mind that archaeology is a fairly recent discipline, what you'll see is that, our discussions of gender is even much more recent than that. That again, it's really only been the last 40 years since the 1970s that we've seen gender come to the forefront of the questions, the kinds of questions that archaeologists have asked and attempted to get at from the archaeological record. So I'm looking forward to having this discussion with you folks in class on Thursday.